Let's do it. 119. Let's do. I only want to do the first and the fourth verse. I really like the fourth verse on this one, the Trinity. So let's do 1 and 4 on 119. Is everybody ready to sing? Turn to 119. 119. Bingo. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. And we pray that all unity may one day be restored. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Oh, Christ Jesus, his only Son, and all praise to the Spirit who makes us one. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Amen. What else we got? Not everybody at once. I'm overwhelmed. 469. Okay. 469. Let's do the first and second verse of 469. Okay, let me get my brain working here. Yeah, 469. I'm having a brain lapse. And I guess it shows I have a brain, but I know it's just spinning though. When we walk I know. What a glory he sheds on our way. Okay, I got When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, we abide with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but his smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Give me one more. And I will try to know it in my head. Okay. 247. Let's do the first and last of 247. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. To the old rugged cross I will ever be true, its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a
Thank you, Greg. I'm moving a little slow tonight. I had a mishap with a hole in the ground. And it was my bad leg went into it and bent my old bad leg back the other way, but it was really exciting for a few minutes. Well, it was only to my hip. I was only done now. So camouflage. I could have still been there tonight. Got myself out. So, and when you got two artificial knees, you don't really want to do that. That's not good for them. So I'm getting up and down a little slowly. Yeah. Well, according to this list, I don't have anyone in the hospital. Is that true? Pat Garrison? Joe Jack. Okay, I thought Jack. It's Franklin Woods now. Okay, Jack's in.
My cousin Jesse Bird is in the hospital. He had surgery this evening at 5. I'm not really sure what it was.
Okay. Okay, you got that, Carol?
Which hospital?
I don't actually know.
Oh.
We'll go with Sycamore.
A hospital. Okay. Any others? And rehab is Bob Holcomb, he's in Bristol, and George Williams in Clinton. Is that any updates, any changes there? No.
George, did Bob get to go home?
Last I heard, he was still over.
Okay, that's what I thought you said.
Okay. Special request, search for a minister. We've got our Animal Youth Minister. We have our temporary minister at the moment, which is good. Eugene and Debbie Davis, Jamie Vines, and Ian Harden. Any updates on those?
That Ian Harden, he's a kid that, he's about 20 years old. He's a local Hampton kid here. He had a brain tumor and they've done several treatments and all this on him. And now he's doing a study in Maryland at one of the hospitals there. They're really not giving them a lot of hope to be able to remove that, but they're traveling now to Maryland, so
Okay.
for his family.
That must be the INH, Institute National, yeah, okay. All right, the expectant moms, we've got Cheyenne Baker, Malin McLean, and Mom and Baby Brown. That's an update on that.
I didn't have a name. That's Brenda's friend.
The mother has Crohn's. They think that there's the little baby that's not. I think she's 25 weeks. The baby has a little swollen abdomen, and they're thinking there may be something wrong. They may have to even fix it before it's.
Mhm.
So, just the mother having
nutritional issue, yeah, an anti-inflammatory issue, okay. Nursing home, Life Care's Helen Hyatt, Sycamore Springs is Lulabelle Street, Marilyn Taylor, Bill Roberts. Hermitage, Linda Chambers, Betty Jo Montgomery, Raymond Crabtree, Margaret Fields. Lake Bridge, Gene Campbell, Mountain City, Gene Buchanan, Kyle Bradley, Mike Dellinger. The Waters, Evelyn Collins, Margaret Crows. Signature, Barbara Hicks, Tammy Wells, Ivy Hall, Opal Baird, Brenda Stout, Betty James, Sally Whitehead, Betty Chambers, Shirley Irick, Jack Howe, Buck Gentry, Hillview, Wanda Laws, and Jack Garrison's in the hospital now. We can take him off of Hillview. Any updates?
We had a good day today. We embraced the good days. We did.
Any others? Any additions we know of? Out of the area, Amy for Africa, Terry Cates, Randy and Belinda Baskins, the Barons, Drew Truelove, the Sumas, Randy and Imelda Morley, Mac and Margaret Hicks, Susie Hakey, and any updates on these folks?
Chris and Amy are still in Africa with the group right now. They've been there for a few more months. Randy and Miller, I think they're doing all right. We went to June for all that.
Okay.
The other day. Go back to Monday.
Susie Hakey is Bonnie Crabtree's niece, I think she said. Going through a lot of issues right now.
All right. Home, Sean Elliott, Randy Payne, Harold Porteous, Daisy Grindstaff, Lanny Carden, Kim Miller, Travis Oliver, Tommy Brown, Ann Richenberg, Bernetta Andrews, Jean Blevins, Dallas and Alice Barker, Betty McNeil, Debbie Edwards, Ruby Odom, Charles Carden, Kenneth Bristol, Emery Fryer, Kenny Williams, Rita Price, Mitzi Baker, Carl Lee Hazelwood, Casey Smith, Joanne Gwynn, Retha Williams, Jean Carroll, Jean and Craig Schaefer. Any updates?
And it's that gal took out. Putting him on, he has a lot of issues with his,
It's, for lack of a better term, it's like Crohn's, only worse.
who's his
Zach Scalf
staff.
is a young man.
He goes to Birmingham Clinic.
Yeah.
Where we have to do the
He's had a variety of surgeries and medicines. Any other updates? Oh, they're both sick. And Jackson Hospital. All right. Sympathy, Jamie Buckles family, Barney McKinney family, Jason Honeycutt family, the Judge Bob Cup family. Any others? Bill Gentry. Bill Gentry family. Uh-huh. And before I go any further, remember, if you've got some definite information about the folks on our prayer list, please get them to Carol so she can get them to John. That's helpful. And praise and thanksgiving. Everybody's praising the sunshine, I can tell you that. So beat you to it. Yeah, that's why I stepped in a hole yesterday, is working in the sunshine working.
Praise that our granddaughter turned 18 today. And with that is the extra prayer request. She's turned 18. Not only for her, but for her parents, because she's very much her mother's daughter, so I'm sure she's going to call out, I'm 18 pretty soon, so.
You just got to tell them, like my folks told me when you turn 18, do whatever you want to, but as long as you live under this roof, these are the rules. Yeah.
Ivy and Ashton are officially landowners.
Yeah, that was,
No, they're gonna be, well, they have a house, they're gonna live in their real house, but they bought a piece of land.
yeah, I was just telling them out there a while ago, said that when Mona and I got married, we owned a 60 Valiant. That was in 1970. It was only 10 years old. I paid $100 for it. But it had 4 new tires. So that's, yeah, that was it. Push button. I have no idea if it ever actually, well, I had to put a quart of oil in about every 3,000 miles because it leaked out. So I never did change the oil. I just kept putting oil in. So that was the thing we owned when we got married. Dad and her mother and father gave us a 15-inch black and white TV that you couldn't haul in a wheelbarrow. It was so big. Nobody here remembers those, do you? Yeah. Have it on a TV stand that could fall over anytime. Oh, well. Lord looks after all of us. All right. All right. Okay.
The kid that I mentioned last week that had a head injury.
Yes.
Basketball in. Well, they sent him out, and he was put back in Tuesday morning to have the surgery. Well, the surgeon came in and looked at it and looked at some x-rays and said, you don't need surgery. It's
Good.
healing on your own, on
Good.
its own. So he played ball last night. He's got a face mask on, but, I mean, that is a prayer.
That sure is. It's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. That's good. All right. Well, before we get started then, Bobby, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Father, we come to you once again, thanking you for how much we serve and love you. Thank you, God, for being so good. Pray, Lord, for all those people listening to our way. Father, I want you to know each one of them. I pray, Lord, you touch them, God, touch their life. Be with us as we go through our lesson, God. And we learn more about you so we can do our best. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Bobby. Well, tonight I'm not going to be in the scriptures as much. We're going to talk about an important historian named Josephus. Now, not Bocephus and all of his rowdy friends. We're going to talk about Josephus and all his rowdy friends. Josephus was a Roman historian, although he was not Roman. Okay, his full name was Flavius Josephus. That was his Roman name. His Jewish name was Yosef ben Mattatiah. Okay, he was born in 37 A.D. and lived to roughly 100 A.D. So he was born 4 years after Jesus was crucified. Okay, and there's a lot of interesting. So we're going to talk about him a little bit and why are we talking about him? Why is he so important? Well, he's been quoted a lot in the Christian literature and in the secular literature, and he was a Roman historian, a very kind of important person to the Romans, but not really. We're going to dive into this some. Because his works have been reviewed and used many different ways. He wrote 20 books on Jewish antiquities. Okay, he wrote 7 books on the Jewish wars, and he wrote 2 books that was in the defense of Judaism. So he would be, in my opinion, more of a Jewish historian, but he's looked at as a Roman historian. And the reason we have a lot of his information is pretty interesting, is the fact that it was the Christian scholars and the Christians who actually copied his works down from the Roman time and passed it down. So a lot of the other scholars and historians at the time lost their information, but a lot of his was copied down and brought down through and I guess everybody remembers at the fall of the Roman Empire, we had what's called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, when there's not a lot of literacy. and monks copied things down and passed them down. But his work was in the original Greek and has been found in different places. And so he is considered fairly accurate. Now, as we talk about this, keep a few things in mind. Okay. He's writing about, for him, a modern time, but then he was writing about the Jewish antiquities, the things that happened. And a lot of his information he obtained was the fact that he was a Pharisee. Okay, he was actually a Pharisee and lived and spent time, of course, in Jerusalem and in the temple. So he's educated as a Pharisee. So he's educated in the Jewish history. So he was able to put this Jewish history, antiquities in there, and the Romans accepted it. And remember, the Romans didn't recognize very many religions. It was important to them. They equated religion and government. They took a lot of the Greek gods, transferred in the Roman gods, and that was their primary gods, which worked with their government. But then after Julius Caesar came around and put together the dictatorship, then what happened was they made emperor worship as part of their worship system to control the people. But they recognized the Jewish religion as a separate entity that was an acceptable religion in the Roman Empire. But later on, and so Christianity originally was not persecuted much until they decided it was actually not a sect of Judaism, but a separate religion. That's when they went to persecute it. So Josephus then, being a Jew, was acceptable in his writings. And we'll talk a little more about that, and I'll read you a story about that in a little while, about how he got where he got. But why is this important? Well, when you look at history, and most of us know the history that we know that came about in our time. The first president I can remember in this country is Eisenhower. That's one of the first I can remember. And so every president since then I can remember. The only way I know about the previous presidents is I read about them. Or my parents would have told me about them, or my grandparents would have told me about them. Because I only had one great-grandparent alive, but I was too young to remember her. So our history that we have, we know, is mostly what we hear and talk about and the oral histories we have. And so unless something's written down and we can see it. So at this point in time in that history, what Josephus did was remarkable. He wrote this information down, and it's been passed down in an accurate representation from that time due to the fact it was Greek, which was the educated language, and the fact that Christians saved it, and it came down through history. There's a lot of other historians we're aware of, but we don't have their information. Interesting enough, if you look at other cultures, for instance, you look at the Chinese culture, Confucius was considered a wise man, but a historian also. So his writings, his information came down through the different generations of emperors in China. And so they have written information about him, but not a lot of other folks. So in any civilization you look at, they have to have a mode of transportation of information. As far as we can go back into the Babylonian history and the Assyrian history, there's other historical antiquities in that area. We've got some of those writings, and everybody's heard of the Rosetta Stone and this kind of stuff. So getting historical information from then to now, this is a remarkable piece of information. It's quite remarkable. So this is essentially written in the year in the first century, 2,000 years ago. And he's writing about things that happened 1,000 years before that. So you can look at that, and it's looked at pretty accurately. So when you read this, when we talk about these things, that's why he's looked at as kind of important as a historian. He's also outside of Christianity is a historian who makes comments about Jesus, about John the Baptist, and about James in his writings. Now, there is some conflict about what he said about Jesus because it was copied down by Christian scholars, and they think that things were added. But the fact he talked about Jesus, the fact he mentioned him, the fact that he talked about James and mentioned him, and only said that he was Jesus' brother. Didn't say he was the brother of the Christ. It was Jesus' brother. And then he talked about John the Baptist in a similar way. It makes you want to understand then that it's pretty accurate what he's talking about, what he's done. So when we look at these things, you can read, there's all kinds of stuff. You can look it up. You can spend hours, which I have, looking at some of these other people that studied his work and things they've talked about and confirmations. But what it turns down to is that he's pretty accurate in what he says and what he did. And they're finding direct information of these things. Remember, in the Bible is also a pretty accurate historical record of what happened in that part of the world over a long period of time. There was the comment was made back in 1935, 1940, that the Bible was a mythological book because it talked about a group of people called the Hittites and the Hittite Empire. Talked about that, and nobody could find existence of it. Well, in the 1970s, they found evidence of the Hittite Empire, pretty much where the Bible said it was. But the empire didn't last but a short period of time. Now, what's a short period of time? Less than 100 years. So you got to look at biblical times, look at our time. Like the time frame I'm talking about in my lifetime is 75 years. I'm 75 years old, and I remember stuff from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. So that's a period of 70 years. Well, during that period of time, we have had World War II. It was just before that, so I would have known a little bit about that. Had the Korean War, the Vietnam War. We've had wars in the Middle East. We've had the Cold War. We've had all this stuff that's happened in this short period of time. Well, 2,000 years from now, if I wrote all this down and somebody found it, that's a myth. Unless you find evidence of that. So the Bible has been confirmed on a lot of things. And so so people have kind of figured out, in the Middle East especially, when you hear about this city that existed in antiquities, they don't find it a lot of times, so they dig down in present day cities. And lots of places in the Middle East, that part of the world is a crossroads of the world. It's where Jerusalem is, where Israel is, Judea is the crossroads of the world. Why? Well, you have Egypt to the south. Okay? Egypt has been a known power for centuries. You had to the east of that the Euphrates and Tigris River, which humanity lived there for a long time. You've got Babylon prior to that. You've got other cities. Nineveh and the existence of Nineveh was questioned. You know, where Jonah was told, go tell them, and he said, don't want to do that, and he was upset that they changed their ways. God wasn't going to destroy him. Anyway, they found evidence of Nineveh. They found evidence that it there existed now. So that was a big area. North of that is the Assyrian Empire. North of that, and you go on around to Greece, all these areas. So all these trade routes crossed through that part of the world, through where the Jews lived. And so what happened in that part of the world was, it's like we all know in our history of city-states. We remember we've studied Western history, and you had Sparta was a city-state. Athens was a city-state. Rome began as a city-state. Rome started out in roughly 735 BC, roughly. It's a small area, and then conquered the entire Mediterranean area. So all these places started off as a fortified city, and then they developed through trade. So all that trade had to get there somehow. Now, across the Mediterranean, you couldn't sail across the Mediterranean for a long time until the Phoenicians, the people from Tarsus, figured out how to use a magnet pointed to the north, and they could sail all the way across the Mediterranean. Otherwise, people didn't sail out of sight of land because they just didn't know where to go to. So what happened was those trade routes all cross in that area. So any high place that had water became important. That's an outpost. How come it's important? Well, it's safety, bandits, this kind of thing. And what they did, they would charge money to caravans coming by to cross their property. Remember in the Old West, the water's over here and the cows are over here, and the guy on the property between your cows and the water, well, you had to pay the guide for your cows to go across and get to the water. Well, they did the same thing back then. So to go through their property safely, you had to pay for it. And so all of these different city-states then had all these different leaders. And that's a lot what Rome had to deal with. So when we talk about these things, we talk about these countries, these circumstances. Remember, even in the Jewish state, when God brought them out of Egypt and they went into the Promised Land, they divided it up into different sections. Okay, and different cities, different sections. And then later on it divided itself after David into two sections, Israel and Judea. Israel's in the north, Judea's in the south, Judea is Jerusalem. And remember, the next thing that happened was the Assyrians came in and took Israel. And then the Babylonians came in and took the Assyrians out in Israel and Judea. And then 100 years later, the Persians came in, whooped everybody. Okay? And then a few hundred years after that, Alexander the Great came along, whipped everybody else. Okay? And then after that, here come the Romans. Come in and took this area. So we're talking about the first century, the church developments when the Romans are there. So the fact that we have this written history about this time is kind of important. And that's what makes this important to us, is because of the way that it occurred. Now, an interesting time in that first century, the Christian church started its development in that first century. And I want to show you a few things here as we get started. Everybody's heard of Herod the Great. I assume everybody knows who Herod the Great is. Remember, he was the guy that had all the babies killed in Bethlehem. Okay? And his father was Antipater. He was the king of that area of Judea and died in 43 BC. And when he died, Herod the Great, the king of Judea, lived from that time to 4 BC. He was the one who brought that whole place together. He was the one who built all these buildings. He was the one who built Masada. He was the one who rebuilt the temple. He's the one who got the temple going. So he was an important part of that Hebrew history. And so Josephus writes about him from his time. Now, he had a lot of failings. We're going to talk a little more about him in a minute. He had a lot of failings. But for 100 years, his family essentially controlled that part of the world. I guess it would be considered his grandson, Herod Agrippa II, died in AD 100. From that time down, there were several different kings, and the place was divided up. And you had also during that time different rulers in Rome who took control of that part of the world. And so when you're looking at that part of the world, you have all these different people in charge for that 100 years. Why is that important? Well, during that 100 years, I mentioned the Romans only recognized their religion and the Jews. And the Christians came along at that time. Well, because of the fact that they had so many different rulers during that time, it was hard for them to put a lid on the Christians, except for Nero. And then later on, of course, Vespasian defeated Jerusalem, but he was going after the Jews, wasn't going after the Christians. Okay? So we had that opportunity then for that 100 years. You have all these different kings and these different people in charge of different parts of the Holy Land there. So you didn't have anybody that was in charge of everything. So that's why you could move from this city to that city and maybe get out of trouble. Move from this city to that city and get out of trouble. Also, probably one of the major advantages, the major things for the growth of Christianity was the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. Okay? Because if you were a Roman citizen, you were protected by the law. You could actually, and what he did, you could actually ask for an audience before the emperor as a Roman citizen. So when they arrested Paul and tried to cause problems with him, he was able to appeal to the emperor, and they had to take him to Rome. He'd been wanting to go to Rome for a long time anyway. So he ends up going to Rome, and you know all the stories about that. So he was able to travel across that entire area and kind of be somewhat protected. So when you're talking about Paul being a Roman citizen, this was an important thing to get Christianity going. And at the same time, you had all these different emperors and different people in charge. So you went from just this jurisdiction to that jurisdiction to that jurisdiction. As a matter of fact, Felix, who was one of the people in charge in that time, his wife Drusilla, who was a Jew and was interested in Christianity, was in that line of ascension from Herod the Great. So Drusilla was an important Jewish person, and she had some influence then that kept Paul from getting his head lopped off at that time. Okay. So when you try to put all this stuff together, I'm sorry, it is confusing. And like I said, I could spend a lot of time just going through this and drive you nuts. But here's an example of the lineage of all the red barks at that first 100 years. That's just the people in charge of Judea, okay? And I've got another one over here. This is the Roman emperors in the first century, and there's that whole list, whole page of them, of different things. And Augustus Octavian was in AD 30, and he goes all the way down to Nero, AD 54 to 60. And then the Flavian dynasty, which is Vespasian, Titus, and a few of these folks that go into 100. So you can see that one of the problems there, good thing, bad thing, is the fact that you had all kinds of different people in charge. And so that allowed Christianity to develop. It's because what would happen when any one group came in that defeated the other group? Well, the same thing that happened at this time happened in the old Bible. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar did when he took over Jerusalem? Who he didn't kill, he hauled off to Babylon. Daniel. Okay? And who was that he hauled off? The smartest and the best. Okay? So he took them. And they did the same thing wherever they went. Anybody that defeated the other group took the best back with them, made slaves out of them, or brought them under their control. So in the Roman world, it wasn't a whole lot different. As a matter of fact, the way you could become a Roman citizen was either if you weren't born Roman citizen, which you could buy your way in by paying the emperor, or you could join the army. As a matter of fact, a significant number of the Roman soldiers were not Roman until they joined the army. And then they could become citizens. So becoming a Roman citizen was a big thing. Let's see. Now let's back up a little bit here and talk a little bit about Herod the Great. In history, he's an important character because they have all the information about him, all the things that he built, all the palaces he built, the things that he did. But he had a lot of problems. First of all, he had 10 wives. Okay? You don't think that's a problem? I don't know how much of a problem you'd call that, but having 10 wives is bound to be a problem. And as a result, he had all kinds of intrigue in the palace. His first wife's name was Doris. His second wife's name was Marianne, but his third wife's name is also Marianne. Marianne 1 and 2. and then he had Malathais, Cleopatra, not the Cleopatra, a different Cleopatra, Pallas, let's see, can't get all the names here straight, Freda, and the last one was Ellipsis. And in there somewhere, he married Salome too in that process. Salome, remember that was the beautiful young lady of his wife. That was not his daughter, was his brother's wife that, okay, in there. And he had a whole bunch of young ones, all of which hated each other, and all of which spent a lot of effort and time trying to put each other out. So when Herod the Great died, it was a catastrophe. Now, Herod didn't like people much. Herod the Great didn't like a whole lot of people. And let's see if I can give you a story about him that you'll like to hear. Herod was, he was the, he was kind of unabashedly the king. He rebuilt the temple, and as a result, he was a favorite among the Jewish folks because he built this temple and had all this money in there. In the 18th year of his reign, Herod started to enlarge and reconstruct the temple at his own expense, which he knew would be his greatest enterprise. After removing the old foundations, he laid new ones and raised the structure of hard white stones. Purple hangings covered the entrance, and a golden vine with grape clusters adorned the area below the cornice. Large porticos with 162 Corinthian columns surrounded the temple, which was supported by walls of unparalleled size. Beyond the first court was a second surrounded by a stone balustrade with an inscription prohibiting a foreigner from entering on penalty of death. Now, that's interesting because Herod was not actually a Jew. Okay, he was related to the Jews, but he wasn't. Within his court was a sacred court, the third court where the temple stood, and to which only priests could go. At the northwestern corner of the temple enclave stood the citadel, which Herod called the Anatona, to honor his friend. Here, the high priest, the Anatona it's Anthony, who was at that time was the leader. Mark Antony. You've heard of Mark Antony. He was buddies with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Here, the high priest's robe was kept, which was worn only when he offered sacrifice. The temple itself was built by the priest in a year and a half and was dedicated in a great celebration. It is said that during construction, no rain fell during the day, but only at night, so that there would be no interruption of the work. This story is not at all incredible if one considers the other manifestations of God's power. And that's words from Josephus. That's what he said. So, interesting. He put a lot of time and money into that temple. And probably what's left today is that temple wall that they call the Wailing Wall. They go to Jerusalem and they have prayers and say, the temple is gone. These big boulders that they put underneath to support it, that's probably what they're talking about. So we're looking at something 2,000 years ago. There's still a boulder still left there. And it was Herod the Great that did it. And apparently God allowed them to build that temple during this time. So he's kind of an interesting kind of guy that way. But when he later in life, he didn't do so well. He got sick a lot. That made him pretty mean. Josephus didn't allude on what he thought was wrong with him, but some other sources said he was the one who had parasites. He's also thought to have a variety of venereal diseases. No, Herod, I'm sorry. But he was so disliked by the time that he died that he was afraid nobody would be unhappy, would be miserable because he died. Nobody would grieve him. So his order was that in Jericho, he ordered 100 of the Jewish noblemen to be put to death at his death, so that so grief would be over all the Jews would be grieved, huh? Yeah, yeah. So everybody be unhappy. It'd be grief when he died. So he ordered 100 of them put to death when he died. Nice guy. Yes, he wrote about that. He actually put that down. And then one of the, I guess it was Augustus, who was the dictator at that time of the Roman Empire. He said, "It's better to be Herod's pig than his son." So if you can believe that. So apparently it wasn't a very good idea to be related to Herod because of what he did. Because he had most of his family, his first wife killed. Second wife, she didn't live very long, but they don't know exactly what killed her. And there was another wife in there who was scheming with her son to take control, and he killed both of them. So not a nice guy. So when you're looking at what's going on at that time, you've got to understand these are people who had absolute power. We're not talking about anybody having rights, anybody having the ability to. Only the Romans had rights. If you weren't Roman, you had no rights. You lived at the behest of whoever was in charge, or you died at the behest of whoever was in charge. And that's hard for us to understand because of how our country was founded. But when you hear these things, and I'm going to run out of time tonight, if you don't mind, I'll do next Wednesday night if you want me to, and I'll proceed to talk a little bit more about other things that were going on at that time, about the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in that area at that time. If you want me to, I'll go into that. It's pretty bad. But you got to remember in this situation, if you weren't a Roman citizen, you could be put to death easily. And if the king decided it, and Herod the Great had this whole area under control because he was buddy with Mark Antony. And when Mark Antony and Cleopatra got put out of power, he buddied up with the next guy. So part of the process was who could you make your friend? And you know how they made them friends? They gave them money. So when they taxed the people, and money came into the king or the governor or the procurator or whoever it was, then what they would do is they'd take that same money and bribe the next guy up. So that's how you got the power. That's how you got that. There's an interesting story. I'll tell one story about Pilate before we quit. You know, Pilate was the governor in Jerusalem at the time that Christ was crucified. Well, when he came into power, he brought his Roman troops with him, not a whole legion, but part of a legion with him to take control. He came in the middle of the night and took power and control and put statues of Caesar in the temple. Almost had a huge uprising right then. Almost had a huge problem right then, and was able to and pulled them out. So he comes out and he says, "Well, how'd that happen? This is a terrible thing. I'll pull all those out of there. We'll get those out of there." He pulled all those out of there, and the Jews thought he was wonderful. Yeah, and it was the king or the governor, not the Roman governors didn't part of it, but the king, Herod was the one who installed all the high priests. He's the one who determined who the priests were. So the family of Levites were the priests, but not all the time. They were, but they weren't. But Herod decided who the high priest was. So the temple has a separate tax. Okay, remember that? That's a separate tax on the people. And then they would bribe the guy above them, the guy in charge, whoever the Roman governor was or whoever was in charge, to become the high priest. So, show me the money. Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about him. I've got a section I'll read you next time about him, talk to me about him specifically, how he got where he got, what happened with him, because he was a Pharisee, okay? And he was a Jewish general that led a revolt against the Romans and survived and became one of the official Roman historians. I have to tell you the story about that. It's a good one. Okay, and he wrote this stuff down. So I'm sorry I didn't dive much into the scripture except talked about the fact that he mentioned three very important people in our Christianity, Jesus, John the Baptist, and James. So when people say, well, some of this is mythological, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, this is an outside source here. But now you got to remember, he wrote for the Romans, okay? But he was a Jew. People don't change much, do they? 2,000 years later, does this not sound a lot like our government situation? Other places in the world hadn't changed a whole bunch, has it? No. All right. Any questions? I know I tried not to ramble. I tried to bring it to make some points, but it's kind of complicated. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That first 100 years is real important when we look back at it. Okay. All right. Floyd, would you dismiss us, please?